Good morning. Welcome to a new day in our family of faith here at West Hills Baptist Church. It is a beautiful day outside. It's almost spring. Those flowers are starting to come up. I know everybody is so excited. We're in our season of Lent where we're preparing ourselves for our holiest day of Easter. It is not far away. That's hard to believe. And I know you are as excited as I am that next Sunday we will gather for in-person worship for the first time in a long time. So this may be the last time I'm ever going to preach to a computer. I don't know. We don't know exactly how things are going to pan out, but we will follow the science and we will do the next right thing. But the numbers are trending in the right direction, basically where we left off the last time we joined in person, and I just hope and pray that it continues because I so look forward to be able to see you in person then. But in the meantime, I'm so grateful to be able to connect with you in this way. Our Old Testament reading is one of my very favorite stories. This is in the 32nd chapter of Genesis. This is where Jacob wrestles with God. Really, really interesting story. It reads this way. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Isn't that interesting? So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. Really, really interesting story. Our New Testament passage reading comes from Gospel of Matthew. This is in the 26th chapter. And I want you to imagine how important the words were that Jesus spoke before the Last Supper. This is the passage that just precedes the words that Jesus used in the Last Supper, talking about the forgiveness of sins. It reads this way. When it was evening, he took his place with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him one after another, "Surely not I, Lord." He answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." He replied, "You have said so." Can you imagine the tension that was in that room at that time? Will you join me in a moment of prayer? God above us, God before us, God within us, be now between us a bridge across which your truth can pass. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, we pray. Amen. I know many of you are like me and are becoming increasingly aware each spring of what starts blooming first, and it's the daffodils that stand out the most. There's not a lot of green plants out yet, so those yellow colors just stand out and kind of pop. That always reminds me of the story when I was a little boy. I was about 7 or 8 years old, and my next door neighbor was Colonel Charles Jett. I ended up doing his funeral years later. Very fine man, but for the purpose of this story, the important part of his name would be Colonel. One day, about this time of year, when the flowers were just starting to bloom, me and my 8-year-old buddy suddenly thought it would be a good idea to collect some flowers for our mothers. And Colonel Jet had all these daffodils surrounding the trees in his backyard that was next to our backyard. What started out in our minds of just getting a couple ended up with each of us holding this huge bundle of flowers. And about the time we decided to leave, we look up and there's Colonel Jet. So in our 8-year-old minds, we said, well, we'll just go walk out this way. And of course, by the time we got there, Colonel Jet was there waiting. And in military style, he said, boys, those are not your flowers. Those are my flowers. So we tried to hand them back to him. No. You might as well give them to your mothers now. This is what I think about that story looking back. Even when you become an adult, you still are amazed at how many people still act and think like children. When you're growing up, you think there's some age, high school or college or some type of professional level when people stop acting and thinking like children. It never ends. I so feel for our friends in law enforcement. They're trying to help our community. They'll tell you that something can happen in broad daylight, and sometimes every single person will say, I didn't see anything. This happens in every community. It happens in all socioeconomic levels, in all parts of our culture. This past week, I saw an interview with a nurse who is on the front line in the fight against the coronavirus. She first talked about how exhausted they are from not just working long, hard hours, but she talked about how incredibly frustrated they are to work that hard, literally trying to save people's lives, only to come home and turn on the television to hear people denying that COVID even exists. Can you imagine? The interview ended by saying they did a poll and 20% of nurses on the front lines intend to find another job when this is over. I cannot imagine their frustration. It appears that this stimulus package that just passed is giving people a little light at the end of the tunnel. This has certainly been the most stressful economic period in my lifetime, so I feel for all the people who are afraid that they're going to lose their home or not to be able to put food on the table. It reminds me of the situation back in 2006 when the House of Cards came down due to these big corporations making foolish decisions and really did not have that much to gain from what they were doing. Do y'all remember this company named Enron? Enron was a huge multi-billion-dollar energy corporation. They were so big and supposedly so strong that they advised their employees not to diversify their 401ks. Do y'all remember this? So thousands and thousands of their employees had invested every penny of their retirement funds in Enron alone. Do you remember they released some audio tapes of some of the top executives? Remember, this was a utility company. The tapes revealed them forcing blackouts for huge areas of California for periods of time. All for what? Misplacing thousands and thousands of people for just a little gain. These were people who would otherwise have been considered extremely successful, making foolish decisions. Now, all of us are confronted in life, not only by the decisions that we have to make, but also those that we allow to happen or are somehow complicit in. And I can tell you from my own experience in the business world that there were things that I witnessed that I knew were wrong, and I chose to remain silent about it. I remember my dad saying, growing up, there's always a way to do the right thing. There's always a way. Let me give you an example that you're not going to expect. When I was a teenager, we ran around a lot, and My dad tried to prepare me for what to do if I found myself in a bad situation. So he said, let's say you're out somewhere and the person who's driving you around starts drinking. He said, you do not have to say to them, I do not approve of this behavior and you are to let me out of this vehicle immediately. He said, there's always a way. Let me give you an example of what you can say. I think I'm about to throw up in your car. He said they will stop the car and let you out. Then you go find a phone and call me and I'll come get you. There's always a way. I think about that because when we are confronted with these things in life, people don't want to be a snitch. They'll often say something like, it's not my place to say anything. Does that sound familiar? I've not been here long enough. Does that sound familiar? There's a lot of people that have been around a lot longer than me. I don't want to rock the boat. All of these sound familiar, don't they? And usually what happens under these circumstances is that something bad happens and we tacitly give it our approval by doing nothing. Now, what is the result of all that? The result is that the bad stuff multiplies easily. In theological terms, it sounds even worse. It allows evil to grow. In this New Testament passage that we read this morning, did you hear Jesus condemning Judas? This was so subtle what was happening. Jesus was letting Judas know that he knew. He knew and that it was not too late. I think he was letting Judas know the truth in his own way. He was in effect saying, you can choose not to go through with this. You can choose differently. I want you to imagine what options Jesus had at this moment. He could have sat down and disclosed to everyone in the room, this is what Judas has done and here's what's about to happen. What do you think their reaction would have been? Do you recall later in the story when the guards come to arrest Jesus, in one of the versions, one of the disciples jumps up and cuts off the ear of one of the guards. Do you remember that? And then Jesus heals the guard. What do you think would have happened in this instance if Jesus chose to simply lay it out on the table for the disciples about Judas? We don't know, but my hunch would be that he would have had to keep the others from tearing Judas limb from limb. Instead, he simply lets Judas know that he knows and that it's not too late. Some of our Christian friends believe that Judas had no choice. I respect their opinion, and I respectfully disagree. Judas was handpicked by Jesus. For what? I believe Jesus saw incredible potential in him. And I believe this story is reflective of this basic belief that we have about love, that love does not coerce. In other words, God is not going to make us do anything. And in this instance, Judas chose, and he obviously thought he knew better than the one he called master. So why would he do such a thing? The approach at our church is very much an educational one. We do not limit ourselves to just one version of the Bible. We use all translations, and we encourage the use of professional commentaries. We use our Sunday school classes and teachers and our Bible studies on Wednesday nights, all these things to try to gain just a little more insight. Remember, God is so vast and mysterious, we can only uncover the tip of the iceberg, but what we can learn can be life-changing. So we want to try to uncover just a little bit more each day so that we can live better lives a little more each day. So scholars tell us that Judas was very likely a zealot. We use that term differently in our culture these days, but in biblical times it meant something very different. You know, when we talk about biblical times, we talk a lot about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There were other groups like the Essenes. We don't talk about them very much, but there was also this group of zealots. And scholars tell us that not only was Judas one, but possibly two, maybe even three of the other disciples considered themselves zealots as well. Why is that important to the story? Because what was most important to the zealots was the overthrow of the Roman occupation of the Holy Land. What was most important to them was to get rid of those Roman soldiers that just made them sick to look at. They wanted them gone. And they wanted, what they really wanted was a military Messiah to do it for them. It seems to me that Jesus must have had this conversation over and over again, not just with Judas, not just with the disciples, but probably with other leaders within the zealots, trying to get them to understand that what he was about was bigger than what they were seeing in front of them. I think it was next to impossible to get them to understand that what Jesus was doing had as much to do with the people of the West Hills Baptist Church 2,000 years later than the people in their own place and time. And so there are many scholars who are convinced that the motivation behind the betrayal for Judas was that he believed he could force the hand of Jesus. It would start the revolution that would overthrow the Romans, and that it would work because God and the Messiah would be on their side. Why would someone do such a thing? So many people have no idea about their input. They allow people to convince them of conspiracy theories. Some things never change. The lengths that people will go to prove themselves right. But let's remind ourselves of a very basic truth, that love by its very nature does not coerce. So God is not going to make you or keep you from doing anything. God will allow us to learn on our own what we refuse to be taught. And in the case of Judas, after he had betrayed Jesus and then realized that he was wrong, he could not bear the thought of living another day. In this New Testament passage that we read, Jesus was telling Judas the truth. He was giving him another chance. He's giving us one as well. Fast forward to the end of the story. Jesus absorbs all of the evil of the world, both then and now, and returns only love. But we look at this passage and wonder, why in the world would someone invite evil into their lives like that? Years ago, when I was teaching high school history and sociology, I came across a video with an interview with Steven Tyler, the lead singer for the band Aerosmith. And it was so interesting that I showed it to all of my students each year at some point. This was back in the 90s, right after the movie Pulp Fiction came out. Do you remember that? And after that movie, there was a big return of heroin use in our country. Remember, this was before the whole opioid epidemic. But when I found out about this spike in heroin use, I was absolutely shocked. When I was growing up, it was such a taboo, and the thought of it coming back and being acceptable in some way was just shocking to me. I always thought it was such an evil thing. I just couldn't imagine why anybody would invite that into their lives. And I remember hearing about it at the high school. So I polled every one of my students and I said, I want you to raise your hand if you know somebody who has tried heroin. And in each one of my classes, 1/3 of the kids raised their hand. I could not believe it. I could not believe that something that terrible had made its way back into our culture. And so I came across this video that was an interview with Steven Tyler. And in this interview, after they talked about all of the success of the band, she asked this question about heroin because she knew that Steven Tyler had overcome this addiction. So she said, "What comes to mind when you hear the word heroin?" And he took a deep breath and he sat back in his seat and he said, I overcame that addiction, but when I hear that word, I'm reminded that I still have a love affair with heroin. So my first reaction is, who has it? How much is it? And how pure is it? And then she said, well, what would you say to a young person who says, well, Steven Tyler did it and he kicked it. Why shouldn't I try it? And he leaned back and he thought for a moment and he said, I would say to that young person, if you want to go through the hell that I went through, be my guest. You might not make it back. Now, here is a person who understands the consequences, understands the terrible things that happened in his life because of the terrible choices he made, but finds it impossible to fully get past this love affair. Here is a person who would understand that God loves us enough to give us the freedom of choice. He wants us to make good decisions. He persuades us. He leads good people into our lives to help us, but ultimately, He is not going to coerce us. And if we choose to think that we know better than the one who created us, then with great sadness, God lets us. This Old Testament passage that we read is one of a struggle. Not just the wrestling that took place by the river that night, but of a lifetime of Jacob's struggles. Good decisions, bad decisions, situations that he felt like he couldn't get out of. The Bible tells us that after they struggled all night, and at the end of this incredible struggle, Jacob says to God, I want you to bless me. It is so interesting. It is almost as if God says, finally somebody gets it. He wants to be blessed for the place that he has made it to in his life. And God says, not only am I going to bless you, but I'm going to give you a new name. As Christians, we are all given a new name. We may always be called by the name we were given at birth, but once we accept the risen Christ into our hearts, from that moment on, we are known as Christians. And it should make a difference. It should make a difference in the decisions that we make. It should make a difference in how we struggle. I want you to know how this takes expression in my life. There have been so many times when I have let circumstances beyond my control get to me. And then after I have gone through it and looked back on it, I realize that God was there for me all along and is with me now. And if I had trusted that truth, then I would not have struggled so much and would have saved myself from a whole lot of pain. Many times when someone comes to talk to me about their struggles, usually about some kind of relationship, I end up using that truth alongside of the lesson that I was taught that there's always a way. Let me give you an example. I had this couple in my church in Kentucky, wonderful people, wonderful Christian people. They had an adult son that had a lot of problems. A lot of problems with boundaries, lots of problems with drugs. I usually have to do a lot of work with people with boundaries, but in this case, I did not have to encourage them to set up healthy boundaries. They had already done that. But in response to that, their son would not let his children see their grandparents. So they were struggling with doing the right thing. They felt like they were being punished for doing the right thing. And eventually, they asked the question, what would God have them to do? And so I simply said this. I said, I know you wouldn't ever want your grandchildren to go through something like this when they're your age. But it is a possibility. They said, that's true. Then I said, so you need to model for them what this looks like if it ever does happen to them. With God's help, there's always a way. So they sent a present every Christmas, every birthday. They wrote letters, sent cards, and tried to reach out to them in every way that they could, not knowing if they got any of it. But they knew that God was going to see them through this. Sometimes you can't change people, but sometimes you can change your family tree. What we have in the story of Easter is evil being overcome by God because Jesus chose differently. That is our guide as Christians. You know, one of these days, I'm going to meet my Maker. And after that, for the first time, at some point, I'm going to meet my great-grandfather for the first time, who was very unkind to my grandmother. He made her sleep in the woodshed, among other things. And when I meet him, if the first words out of his mouth are not, I am so sorry for the way I treated your grandmother, then we are going to have a disagreement right there in front of St. Peter. But here's the miracle. None of us in our family has ever treated our children the way that he treated her. The faith of my grandmother that was passed down to my father, that was passed down to me and my family, modeled for us a better way. It is hard to grasp the concept that what we do as Christians is not just about the here and now. What we do as Christians has eternal implications. And what it requires of us is to choose differently. And now unto him who is able to keep you from falling and present you faultless before his presence with exceeding great joy. The only wise God, our Father, be glory and majesty, dominion and power, both now and forevermore.